so that we can have it also for the rest of our community. But again, thank you all for joining, and thank you, Mariana, for joining our SU digital community for now. We are I want to welcome everyone to this is our second lecture from this semester. And I'm really excited to see both students and instructors joining from other parts of our Syracuse community on main campus and here in Florence, but also sort of to be able to extend these conversations with a larger audience outside of the university proper. And so it's really inspiring to see how we continue to try and find ways to sort of come together under the pressure of this sort of ongoing pandemic, which we're hopefully going on the outside of it soon. I also want to thank again Dean Speaks and Associate Dean Julia Cerniak for their help and their support in sort of coordinating these events. So today, I am really excited to welcome Mariana Pestanda to our join our sort of community. And in the past few weeks, the conversation with our students here in Florence, we're sort of doing a studio that is called Borgo Digitale, or Digital Borgo. And their conversation has been sort of focusing on the issue of design intent, or how do we frame design beyond the definition and construction of a single isolated artifact, and instead think of design practices as sort of collective endeavors, connecting individual entities with larger communities and ecologies, where the two sections have been going at this from two different trajectories, from zooming in or zooming out, but always at the core was the idea of creating this sort of network of connections between the object of design, let's say. So really thinking of design as sort of the making of a worldview that engages humans and other than humans agents alike. Our primary ambition has been to think through the articulation of a community, as I was saying. A space can be understood both a physical and a conceptual gathering that moves beyond what in some of the readings that you suggested can be described sort of as dualist ideologies. And so from this perspective, I really could not imagine a better speaker to join us to fuel and sort of inspire our conversation than Mariana. Her research and curatorial projects can be considered an exemplary reference of interdisciplinary design practice. I find particularly inspiring to see her commitment to the role of fiction as a critical design tool. Fiction understood as sort of an investigation that supports the imagination of new relationships between objects and ideas, I should frame it. And so really, I think that in this sense, the design of this new possible worlds that she puts forward is really not to be understood as an escape from our current reality, but rather as a way to sort of look anew to our current cultural and political condition. The practice of world building as a radical practice to dislodge patterns of discrimination, exclusionary violence in favor of networks of empathy, as she, I'm sure, will speak of today, and ecological justice. So I'm going to try and keep this as short as possible to be very respectable of this sort of coordinated time across multiple continents. So I'll keep your bio short, but we have provided links to students and to our audience to see more extensively your work. But Mariana Pestanda is an architect and an independent curator interested in critical social practice and the role of fiction in design for an age marked by technological progress and an ecological crisis. She's a member of the collective The Decorators, an interdisciplinary practice that makes collaborative public realm interventions and cultural programs. Marina co-curated the exhibition of The Future Starts Here at the V&A in 2018, and the Eco-Visionaries, Art and Architecture After the Anthropocene at the MAAT in 2018 and the Matadero and the Royal Academy in 2019. Currently, Marina is the curator of the 5th Istanbul Design Biennial titled Empathy Revisited, Designs for the More Than One, which many of the students have read both your statements and the reference reading, really inspiring. So thank you for sharing those. A biennial that it's sort of ran in October 2020, and I think is going to have another iteration in April 2021. So I'm really excited to hear about this. And Marina is also a researcher at the Center for Other Worlds and assistant professor of design at the School of Communication, Arts and Information Technologies at the Universidad de Lusofon. Sorry, I'm sure I did mispronounce that one.
Lusofon, yeah.
But thank you again, Mariana, for joining our lecture series. Please welcome you.
No, thank you so much, Daniele, for the invitation and for the thoughtful introduction. You'll have to send it to me. So it's a really beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here and to be part of your program, which I have read and yeah, super happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion afterwards and the questions you may all have. Thank you all for being here too. So I've prepared a presentation that I can share with you with some images. So I'll just share my screen. Just 1 second. And I'll speak with you about the Istanbul Design Biennial, this 5th edition, which, as Daniele mentioned, is taking place. It began in October 2020, but it's a very slow and ongoing, developing project that culminates in April. On the 24th of April, we will have an online day. So you're all invited to that, of course, where we will present an overview of some of, especially the research projects. I'll tell you more about those in a minute. But we called it not quite a finissage, because the nature of the projects that we are doing is that they don't really end exactly. They don't really reach a final form. So we can never say that it's closed. But on the 24th, what we will do is there are 4 new projects that we will launch then. And we will also, it's a moment more for sharing, for the designers and participants to share what they've, where they're at this moment. So let me just begin. You have to tell me if you see my screen if it's full screen. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, it's perfect.
And you don't see your windows, speaker windows. Okay, perfect. Great. So I thought that I would begin by showing you where this journey began, and in that give you an introduction to my work with the decorators, because I'm an architect by training, and my practice is above anything. It's a design practice, and I do curatorial work, but the methodologies that I use are informed by my design practice, and especially my work with the decorators. And so I'd like to begin with an introduction to where it's quite literal. This is where I was at when Deniz Ova, the director of the Istanbul Design Biennial, first approached me, and I was in this place very precisely, which is in the Azores, the São Miguel Island, in the archipelago of Azores. And I was doing a project with the decorators, my practice, which is me together with Chavillar Font, Suzanne O'Connell, and Carolina Caicedo, for a festival that's called the Walk and Talk Festival. It's an arts festival. And this was in 2019. And this is where we were. And the Azores is an archipelago that sits between three tectonic plates. It's a volcanic archipelago. And it was populated by humans in the 15th century. Since then, it's been subject to many expeditions and experiments, including, for example, the acclimatization of plants before they were brought from the South Hemisphere to the North European botanical gardens. So it was this territory that was not that was populated by humans quite late. Until then, only one mammal lived in the island, a bat, a species of bat, but much of the expeditions that took place to the Azores, which were done by, to a great extent, rationalist minds, let's say, of the north of Europe. They resulted in books like these two that you see on the right. And these are books that offer a perspective on the island, an outsider perspective on the islands. And what they do is they categorize and they classify plants, species, peoples, landscapes, minerals, very much in tune with the spirit of the Enlightenment that motivated many of these expeditions in the 19th century. But when we were doing field work in the Azores in preparation for our project, what we found was that these volcanic events that take place, this image that you see here in the background is the last eruption, the last big eruption that happened in the Azores in the 1950s, which was televised completely. And so it's a very traumatic experience to watch the eruption of that took place in the islands. I know that for you in Italy, this is also a very present reality. What we found in the Azores, because there's an insularity almost about the Azores, because it's so far detached from the mainland of Portugal, this is Portuguese territory, is that often in Azores, they speak of a double insularity. So within, it's an archipelago that's isolated in a way, and then the islands are sort of further isolated from one another because they're quite distant from one another. But what we found when we were there was that there were a number of religious ceremonies and practices and rituals that of the contemporary time that still are incredibly linked to these natural phenomena, such as, for example, this procession where all the men in the island of São Miguel go to every chapel.
If it seems like there's a spigot.
Oh.
I just muted that person.
Okay, it wasn't a question, was it? Because there was a little delay. No, okay. And so in those rituals, often they will ask for the volcano to stay calm, right? Because the eruptions often evicted populations in very dramatic ways over history, of course, and so these religious practices developed in relation to those events of eviction and of relocation of entire populations. So anyway, what we found was that that events like this one, in a way, were better placed to deal with some of the incommensurable or unintelligible dimensions of these phenomena. So we were we were interested that not all dimensions could be captured by the rational systems of thought that these expeditions and subsequent books put forward. Things like the magnetic properties of rocks, the impending ascent of the lava, all the suspense that comes with it. They defied logical scales because they can hardly be predicted, or often they cannot be predicted. And so these myths and rituals, both sacred and profane, in a way, they capture the strength and the magnitude of these events in a way that we found was at times more rigorous almost. So when working, as a practice, we decided that our approach to this landscape would also take the form of an expedition. But, and so at the time we called it expedition empathy, and I will get back to that. And we, so what we did is we got together a group of artists and thinkers, and we came to the islands of the Azores, and we did a series of interventions in the landscape, and then organized a day where we walked across different territories and visited those kinds of places. But our idea was to organize an expedition that began from a position of doubt, and that didn't try to explain, but rather was trying to merge with the landscape, and was trying to open questions about it. So this is for one of the projects that we did, which we designed ourselves, which was a very, very long table, was also in the first slide, in an area called Furnas, where it's very common to cook underground. So if you see in this aerial image, you'll see some round holes on the ground. So we very simply just designed a table that was very long and then had a hole in it. And we made that hole coincide with a hole in the ground. And then we worked with an artist, Inês Neto dos Santos, who developed a bread recipe in collaboration with a local cook. And then we cooked the bread underground, and then we had this pulley system where everyone sitting at the table would collectively pull the bread from under the earth when it was cooked, and then eat it collectively. So this is to introduce you to the kind of practice that we at the Decorators have, which develops these methodologies of deep listening to the context in which we are operating, and then creating infrastructures for collaboration. In this case, it took the form of an expedition. Other times it took the form of a restaurant or some kind of structure that then generates many collaborations. And then within each collaboration, for example, this one with Inês Neto, well, the expedition had several actors, and then with Inês Neto dos Santos, we developed this recipe. She in turn collaborated with this local chef, and then there was also this moment of communal eating that was this celebration that you see here in the image. And so when approaching a curatorial project, I often take these, learning that I've done in 10 years of practice with the decorators, and obviously that those methodologies are present. They, of course, they get distorted and transformed by the context, but I wanted just to let you know this is where I'm coming from. And also I wanted to tell you that when we called this an expedition empathy, we did this very intuitively. We thought, what could it, how could we name this expedition in a way that translates in a relatively intuitive way this desire to merge with the landscape, to learn from the context, to begin with this position of doubt. And at the time we called it empathy. And it was really interesting because when we were there and I introduced the starting point and the title of the project, an artist was doing a residency brought to my attention that empathy as a term was also a 19th century construction. So very much like the expeditions that we were in a sense critiquing, empathy is a term that had emerged in the, well, at the turn of the 20th century, but it had around 100 years of history. And so it was following that I, so when I was sort of exposed to all this, I started thinking about the biennial, and I wanted to develop this research strand, right? And think, okay, what if I was curious about empathy and what empathy could do as a term. So that's when I became familiar with Susan Lanzoni's fantastic work, her 10 years of research into the term empathy and how it developed over time. And if nowadays we tend to think of empathy as the understanding or grasping or even simulating of someone else's feelings, actually when the term entered circulation about 100 years ago, it was used to describe how feelings transferred between people and objects and the natural world, and how things like chairs and paintings and sculptures elicited certain bodily sensations and emotions in us. Empathy was translated in the beginning from the German Einfühlung, and which means this idea, or contains this idea of feeling into. And one of the first people to write about empathy was Violet Paget, who wrote under the pseudonym Vernon Lee. And she did a series of experiments together with her partner, Kit, where they would analyze how certain objects like this chair, which was one of their objects of study, how it would elicit certain bodily sensations in them. So it was a form of aesthetic experience, and empathy was used in the context of an embodied aesthetic theory. And Violet Paget described empathy as the lending of one's life to a thing, which could be, these are just some examples of things that that she referred to or analyzed. And so to empathize is by definition feeling into something else. And so it contains in it this idea of disembodiment, of decentering, right? So what interests me is not the idea of humanizing the other, but the idea of othering the human. So I'm interested in destabilizing this boundary between the two, between one and the other, and how empathy, in a way, is a tool that invites us to do that. Of course, skeptics might say this is a pointless exercise. How can we ever escape our anthropocentrism? How can we ever escape our situatedness? And indeed, this is a very, it's a physical impossibility. But I really trust that in the effort of escaping one's center and in this movement of detaching from one's body, that and the simulation of seeing from another perspective, that we may see the world differently. And I mean, this is what fiction does so well as well. Narrative fiction is a gesture of recentering, and we can come back to it if you'd like later on. But now in 2020, in a digital world and in face of a very serious climate crisis, obviously also the general state of social deprivation brought about by the pandemic, this biennial, when working for the biennial, I was interested in taking back empathy back to its roots, so to recover this original meaning of empathy as the idea of feeling into the others and the natural world, but putting it in this context, in this contemporary context, and asking, like, what does this mean? Of course, we know that the interdependence, the coexistence of humans within larger ecosystems, as you are exploring in your classes, has been subject to many disciplinary and interdisciplinary discourses in the last years, with a greater emphasis, I believe, in the last decade, in various fields, from anthropology to science, philosophy, and in design too. And so we are aligned with those discourses, and we want to revisit empathy as a means to interrogate how we may relate emotionally with other species, with other bodies, and they can be biologic or geologic or machinic even. And I'll show you what we mean by that. So let's say if the question was, what does empathy do if we bring it to the design fields today? Then our attempt at answering that question was this idea of designs for more than one. Designs that take into consideration not just one body, not just an immediate client, not just an immediate user, but the complexity of entities and their interlocked and systems in which they operate that are inherent to any new design production. So we presented design as a tool to see from other perspectives, to connect with other bodies, to form communities across different dimensions and scales. And this was our starting point. So I want to show you maybe I'll go back here. So this was our starting point. This is what me, at this point we were a curatorial team. So I was working with Sumitra Upham and Billy Muraben. And with this, let's say, with this line of questioning, which is what I shared with you with my curatorial essay, we then reached out to designers, thinkers, activists, and what I'm going to share with you now is how they have responded to these questions that we opened up. But also what I've attempted to do is also to reflect about what we have learned from these works and these responses. So one important aspect is that when we were speaking about empathy in our curatorial discussions, in our curatorial meetings, the limitations of scale and embodiment came up really often. So the questions like, if we cannot see or perceive the bodies with which we are designing, what tools may be used to overcome it? So throughout the scope of the biennial, design was used and discussed as a tool to sense the world and help us see more than our naked eyes allow, in a way. And so this sensing offered different perspectives and connected viewers with elements and matters and living beings with which they wouldn't naturally connect with. So I'll show you some examples of that. This is a still from a VR experience by Callum Bowden. And this work is called Dark Origins. And it's a VR experiment. It was shown at the biennial as a narrative film. So it's a walk through this digital world that Callum created. And in this narrative, our perspective as viewers shifts between human, bacterial, geologic, and machinic perspectives to reveal mysteries that have to do with extremophiles. So these are creatures that live in extreme conditions. For example, no sunlight. A few years ago, there was a really important piece of a research project that revealed that there was more life under the earth than on top of the earth, right? So there are more living entities, there's more biodiversity in the darkness. Can you imagine, of under the earth? You probably know this already. than on top of the earth. And when Callum read about this, and I remember reading those articles as well, and being fascinated about this. And so that's what really prompted him to create this work. And I just want to read a quote that by him. He says that VR provides a means of encasing oneself within worlds that are completely other, and of becoming other with the world, slipping from the familiar human scale into other strange scales of perception. So in this VR experience, because you shift your perspective, you see at different scales, and at some point you encounter these extremophiles, right? These creatures that strive without sunlight. A different example is this work, it's a science fiction movie by Alice dos Reis, where a marine biologist that's leading a project of mapping the Atlantic Ocean, the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, develops a relationship of friendship with the subject of her research, which is krill. So krill is a small crustacean. You cannot see krill almost at when there's only one element of it, but when krill swarms and then it forms these really large red clouds, then you see it when it exists as a group. You can recognize its shape and form. And the character uses a nano camera that she places inside an individual krill. And she uses this camera as a means to overcome the distance between her scale and the scale of the crustacean. And then she falls in love. This idea of how we relate to an other which we cannot see is also something that is very much present in the work of Paula Gaetano Adi, who works in robotics for a long time. And for the biennial, she created a robocalyptic manifesto, which calls for the liberation of all robots and a general strike of all the robots. She believes that we must move beyond this illusionary narrative of robots for care, robots for companionship, the idea of artificial intelligence as effective. And we need to create a new history where humans and robots are in alliance. There isn't a hierarchical difference between them. So this idea of how technology enables us to decenter, to move outside of our body is something that is present in many projects across all programs. Then a second idea I wanted to share with you is this idea of unraveling complexity. So when we think about how we have, as society and historically and culturally related to other living entities, when we think about how in the present time humans control or domesticate or patent or other living entities, we thought that one interesting way to analyze how those relationships have been maintained is through food systems. So, because we believe that on the one hand, food is a subject that is interesting to many people. So in that sense, it works almost like a Trojan horse because everyone cares about food. But also because through food systems, we can see how living entities have been associated with qualities of possession, of property, of value, which have rendered them inert and detached from social and ecological relations, so without agency. And so this part of this, let's say, this moment in today's talk, I wanted to share with you how we began also to unravel our existing relations with other species, the values that lie beneath them, And I'd like to share a number of projects that have mapped the complexity of those relations through two programs. One is the Critical Cooking Show, and the other is the Library of Land and Sea. So I'll begin with the Critical Cooking Show. So this was a series of a series of films that we presented online entirely, and they all departed from an ingredient or a kitchen tool to reveal much more complex geopolitical stories. Let's put it that way. This is just a map we created depicting some of the subjects that came up in the films, and I'll show you two examples to give you an idea of what this program is about, and also as an invitation for you, if you haven't watched the Critical Cooking Show, all of the episodes are available online. Why a critical cooking show? We thought that the cooking show is a format that has been perfected for the screen, and so we thought that in the current scenario of digital saturation, it would be interesting to present research, because many of these projects are incredible, or they result from incredible research projects, but in a way that was digestible in a sense and good to watch from home. So I'll show you an example by Linda Schilling-Quellar, who is an architect and researcher, and she looked at the avocado toast as the starting point of her film. What's interesting about this project is it starts with the trend of avocado toast on Instagram, hipster cafes, etc. But then it takes you on a journey to investigate the patents that avocados as a fruit, right, that have been subjected to, the politics behind those patents, but also the patenting of irrigation systems, for example, and how they have dramatically transformed the landscape surrounding the Betorga River. So, sorry about that. Just show you an excerpt.
For this recipe, we will need the following ingredients: an artificial and accidental new variety of avocado, it's 1935. Somewhere in La Habra Heights, California, Rudolph has developed what would be the first house avocado tree. Mixing a few varieties in his house backyard, an unforgotten bunch of seedlings found their way to the hands of his grandchildren, who found the fruit appetizing. Rudolph has patented this new plant August 27, 1935.
I hope the sound was okay. I'll show you another example by Vivian Kakuri, which is New World Syrup. And this film reveals an unexpected connection between mosquitoes and sugar plantations in the 18th century, which was a very unique moment for Latin America. And so she makes these links between sugarcane plantations, yellow fever, Catholicism, the production of sweets using egg yolk, and how music as well, and how all of these elements were reflected in colonial interactions, especially between Portugal and Brazil, and the consequences that they had for South American bodies. And again, I'll show you a very short excerpt just for you to see to get to know a little bit the universe of the film.
O amarelo sempre foi acordo entre terra e humanidade. Trabalhe a terra e você terá a abundância amarela.
So of course, Vivian, in her very humoristic and ironic style, tells really disturbing stories connected with these processes and around the color yellow. You can watch the complete film online if you want. Another project that also practice this kind of complexity unraveling was the Library of Land and Sea. So we commissioned 10 research projects that were taking place in the Mediterranean basin. And we presented them in Istanbul at the beginning of the research project in the form of a library. So we opened an archive in the city for people to come in and become researchers themselves, right? This was a place you could book a table at, and then you could examine archival material, documents, photographs, maps that were created by these different researchers. And each of the projects then developed into a legacy outcome. And this is what we will share on the 24th of April. But I'll give you a sense of what was on display in Istanbul. One of the projects that we showed was the cosmogony of racial capitalism by Dele Adeyemo, who is an architect and researcher. And this is an investigation into the birth of capitalism and how it emerged out of the relations of power forged in sugarcane plantations, again. So as Dele says that prototyping practices of colonization, industrial agricultural production, and Atlantic slavery, Europe's sugarcane plantations would propel the expansion of capitalism across the planet, transforming notions of race in that process. So what Dele did was he forced us to distort the map of the Mediterranean all the way down to the Guinea coast of Africa. He identifies the sugarcane plantations in the island of Madeira in Portugal as the first exercise in global capitalism. So what he did with this research project was he took as a point of departure the meeting between the Portuguese and the Edo people in the Kingdom of Benin, which was a living society in West Africa, among the Yoruba, and he recovered these long neglected histories that narrate the extension of the Mediterranean to the Guinea coast. To do this, he looked at European cartographies of this time, but he also looked at artifacts and objects and cultural artifacts that were present in that were produced by the Yoruba. So his project is an exercise in mapping different cosmologies, so different perspectives into images. We also asked everybody in the Library of Land and Sea to share with us some of the books and the documents that were important to them. So for example, this is the bookshelf that Dele put together. And here's an example of this cartographic exercise that combines practices of European and African societies to explore a different narrative about how the initial conditions for global capitalism came into being. To give you another example of a project in this Library of Land and Sea, very different, the project by Aslihan Demirtas with her students from Kadir Has University. And this was a project that compiled a collection that mapped really the food production in the city of Istanbul from soil to supermarkets. And so on the right, you see a map that illustrates a repertoire of differing typologies of urban agriculture, food networks that exist currently in Istanbul. But also they compiled, so this is the map, sorry. Here you see, like, let's say the result of this exercise of compilation. They also compiled homegrown produce during the pandemic through social media. So how people are growing food, perhaps, well, apparently a lot more than they were before, since the general lockdown. And they created a prototype, which is this table and stools that contain soil. This project, it's both, let's say, an announcement of something bigger that they are doing as their legacy outcome, that they're building a new garden in the city of Istanbul. But also it's important to refer that in Istanbul, there are these 1,000-year-old urban market gardens that still exist, called bostans, and many of them are at risk of disappearing. So through processes of gentrification and regeneration, many of them are contested spaces. And so in this, let's say, this sculpture, in a way, Aslıhan Demirtaş wants to bring our attention to soil and the value of soil, and how discussing what happens to soil in the city of Istanbul is really, really important for the near future. And in this image, we captured just the first moment when a little plant came out of this, of this soil. It wasn't planted, this soil, not intentionally, right? But there's a richness that comes with any soil. And by the end of the first week or two, this was completely green already. And then I wanted to bring your attention to another program, which is New Civic Rituals, and this idea that is very present in the biennial of rehearsing futures, of using the biennial as and the cultural context of the biennial as a means to test out ideas, experiment with doing projects that wouldn't exactly be possible outside of this cultural framework. So we've commissioned a number of rituals, we call them rituals, I'll tell you why, in the city, both in the European side and in the Asian side. And so here, this map just shows you more or less where they are located. Of course, rituals are these series of gestures that are performed normally according to a certain order, and normally because they have a symbolic meaning. We were interested in inviting citizens to perform new protocols and to develop new modes of engagement with entities beyond their immediate scale. So we were interested in projects that would invite citizens to consider what citizenship is and to broaden what they think of as citizenship exactly. I'll show you some examples. So some of these projects are they have to do with what we could call human empathy, let's say. So they are design objects that generate communities around them. This is an example of a project that came from Lebanon. So this was existing already. I think it's the only case of a project that already existed. It's called the Revolution Wood Stove, and it was created by Beats to Atoms and made in Beirut for the revolution in Lebanon in 2019. It's a very simple wood stove that allows people to make tea, coffee, and even bake a cake or bread. It uses wood only. It's very easy to assemble in less than a day. And it was designed to support the revolution, so to support the protesters in the cold during the winter in that process. But when we bring it to Istanbul, of course, then we must think how does this project exist within the reality of the city? And so one really important aspect of these new civic rituals was that we created a young curators group based in Istanbul, and we formed this group for the biennial for the first time. So they are Nur Horsanala, Ulya Soley, and Eylül Şensiz, the three curators that formed this group. And they had a really, really important role because they were in charge of establishing a connection between the designers and the projects that were coming to the city, but also the communities that were hosting the project in the city. So for each of these projects, we elected a host. And then the project was developed in collaboration between designers and hosting entities. Because these projects remain in the city after the biennial. So we wanted to make sure that they are cared for. There are a number of projects that we are installing that have to do with new forms of collectivity through food. I'll just show you a couple of examples. This is a solar kitchen that we are developing with Marti Guichet. We are developing with Public Works a series of food preservation units. So one that uses smoking, one that uses drying, and one that uses the burial of food as a technique of preservation. And we will install them in a public park. So these are all public facilities that will be available for the citizens to use. Another of these projects that form new collectivities is by Pestana, a group of Swedish architects who for a long time have been researching how public space is used and the gendering of public space. And they have found that public space is used by boys and young men a lot more than it is used by girls and young women. So they through dance platforms, they generate spaces that encourage women to use public space actively. In Turkey, this is particularly important because the history of dance and the history of politics, they go hand in hand. But so for Istanbul, they designed this stage in a public park. And at the end, you see this shell. And this is a speaker. So the way this works is you connect your mobile phone to the speakers via Bluetooth, and you play your song and you can dance. So I'll show you a clip I have of when it was the first week it got installed and how it was Okay, you get the idea. So this was really a happy moment for us, right? Because it's really interesting when these projects come to life and how they are then activated. One really important thing to say, though, is that in this case it was Ulya Soley, the curator based in Istanbul, that worked with Pestana as designers of this dance stage, but also created bridges with dance academies, hip-hop groups, feminist groups in the city of Istanbul, who were really active in the design of the structure and also are designing its activation, of course. We can talk about that more if you'd like. But then to end, I'd like to show you a couple more examples of how some of these objects explored not just human empathy, let's say, but also, in this case, machinic empathy. This is a project by Soft Baroque. It's called Point Cloud, and on the left is the image that they've created digitally, which is made of these nodes, right? So point clouds are nodes that when machines read reality, they identify certain points. So think about, for example, facial recognition systems. What they do is they identify certain key points, and then they join them together, forming a mesh, which then results in a three-dimensional shape. So Soft Baroque wanted us to think and consider how machines read reality and bring that to the vocabulary of our urban environment. So they've created these furniture pieces that we have installed in the city, and they are designed with this principle, as if they were designed by machines. Soft Baroque are really interested also in how artificial intelligence and consciousness are developing and what their role might be in design processes in the future, and how machines may feel or how they may design in a near future when they have that kind of agency. And here you see the objects already in location being used by different people in the Beşiktaş Pier in Istanbul. And finally, some of these projects rehearse more than human empathy, or we could say forms of interspecies collaborations or collectivities. This is the case of a project we are also developing and will be launching now in April with Studio Ossidiana. This is a floating island called Buyukada Songlines, which will be an interspecies architecture, which is designed taking into consideration, of course, the human pleasure of being in a garden, but also the migrating patterns of birds that fly over the Prince's Islands and the city of Istanbul in this time of the year. So they have been doing a lot of material research, but also developing different kinds of forms, perches, and architectural elements that cater for these different species that exist together in this place. So this is a map we've just made, which sort of overlaps all of the programs, and I thought I would use it just to make some final reflections. So as I said, I'm trained as an architect, and my curatorial practice is above anything. It's a design practice, and it's a spatial practice. There are these key methodologies that I've attempted to use. So one is this idea of deep listening, so learning from the context of the city, both in terms of the food culture of a city like Istanbul. We started doing research right from the beginning, but also learning from these everyday practices of interspecies designs that are present in Istanbul today, like the Ottoman bird palaces or the stray cat houses. There's this radical hospitality methodology. So the idea that we constructed a cascade of collaborations from the young curators group to participants, to the curatorial team, to the carers of the projects, the hosts that receive the projects in the city. And then finally, this idea of rehearsing ideas that may exist at the moment between reality and fiction. And we hope that through a program like the Biennial, we can make these ideas a bit more plausible, a little bit more real, by inserting them in everyday contexts and intersecting them with everyday life. So yes, I think I'll end here. Thank you so much for your attention. And yeah, I look forward to any questions or doubts, to hearing about those that you may have.
Thank you so much, Mariana. This was really a super exciting conversation and presentation. I would, tons of questions. I have my notepad plus plenty of comments and curiosities, but I really would like to give some space to the students first, from here in Florence, or our main campus, really, to start the conversation and see where we go from there. So feel free to just jump in and ask Mariana some questions.
Questions or comments you may have, also happy to see those.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how different modes of production might affect empathy, because you had various, like with the bread, you had that great communal production of the whole process, and then they got to eat it together. And then with the one you just showed in Istanbul, you had a designed object that was designed for a community to center around, but not designed by the community.
Mm-hmm. So these different modes of production, yes. So what we set up was as a system of hosting. Yes, I would say more than collaboration. So there's a designer is developing a particular research or a line of work we open up at the biennial an opportunity for that strand of work to be tested in a real context, but we don't want to parachute that into the city, right? So this was something we were really concerned about. And so I thought that by creating a system of hosting, that we could create a context, prepare the ground in a way in the city to receive that proposition. So often what that resulted in, so for example, in the Revolution Wood Stove that I showed you, the hosting group was Urban Co-op, which is a cooperative of young urbanists and architects that are based in Istanbul. And they worked with Bits to Atoms to choose the location, for example, choose a place that would, where it would make sense for this stove to exist. But they also had a dialogue with the people that are around that place, from tea sellers to some people that even live on the street nearby, to understand whether this would be something that they would welcome. And then what they also did was they extended this conversation to other groups in the city. So for example, so Bits to Atoms is a maker space, and they organized the workshop for other maker spaces, so that to understand whether there would be opportunities for other wood stoves to be installed in the city, or interest, or right, but also for the maker spaces in Istanbul to share what they have been doing with Bits to Atoms. So it created this dialogue, I think, across similar practices, I suppose, but also, you know, with processes like we're always learning, and each one of them was a project in its own right, where it differs so much from one to the other, but there's always this structure, the design, let's say the project, and then the hosting community, and then the project is the result of that dialogue. I hope this answers your question.
Yes.
Come on, don't be shy. I know we're on Zoom and it's difficult to empathize, but maybe. But I've seen many questions online. Just feel free to jump in.
I have a question. This is probably a horrible source, but I saw a TikTok that was talking about this philosopher, Saint Augustine, and it was his back in like the 3rd and 4th century, I believe. It was his critique of the theater, where he didn't like it because he thought like it was giving the viewer emotions that they haven't earned through real life experience. But I think like looking at the work that you've produced, would you then argue that like this is not true? And in fact, like talking about the VR, is that these other mediums outside of real life experience could actually open it up to something you couldn't normally feel or connect with?
That's a really good question. So yeah, this is something I discussed a lot with Callum, for example, but other participants too. So on the one hand, the extent to which the experience that you get through a medium like VR or AR is anything like or but the experience of real life. Of course, that's one question, but and the reality of that experience, but also like what's the purpose of in this effort of shifting your perspective. In the case, let's say, in Callum's work, as I explained, there's this, you become, in the beginning, you're a scientist, and then you enter a tunnel, and when you exit that tunnel, all of a sudden you're of a different scale, and you're an extremophile yourself, and you meet others and so on. What's the point of it, right? What is to be learned in this? And here is when I really turned to fiction, because I think that those questions have been asked a lot of around literary fiction. So when you read a book about a reality that doesn't exist, right? Do you learn anything in that process? So there's this author that I really like, Mary-Laure Ryan. She's a theorist of literature and literary fiction, and she says that the narrative fiction always begins with a decentering gesture, right? The author creates a new universe and creates a reality around that universe, and then he makes a pact with the reader, saying, okay, we both are going to behave as if this other universe was real. For the pleasure of our experience, we will go through this, we'll pretend it's real, then we'll come back to the actual world, to the real world, knowing that what we've done was a fictional exercise. However, there's a lot to gain from that experience. I mean, think about Margaret Atwood, how your ideas around freedom may have changed after you've watched some of her fictions, or with many other fiction writers. So there is after the experience of the fictional, it is clear that we gain a critical perspective on reality, because we have considered ideas and possibilities that we haven't conceived of in the real world before that. So I think it does allow us to see from a different perspective. And I do think, in terms of an emotional lexicon, I'm not sure. I think we would have to ask someone who is more of a specialist, and whether, but I think it's a really interesting reflection, to something to think about for sure.
We have time for one more question. Anybody wants to jump in?
I'll jump in. So when you were discussing empathy on a psychological standpoint, you expressed how meaning and understanding over time has kind of altered. So I was kind of wondering what your standpoint is and the understanding of how, with the increase of exposure to such like different technologies and social medias and such, how that has kind of impacted the taking on so much more in the day and age. Is our brains not able to adapt or evolve to understand empathy, or has empathy changed over time because of that?
Because of our exposure to, sorry, could you, because of what? Sorry, I lost you for a tiny bit.
Sorry. Yeah, no. So the question was more with an influx of technology and just kind of mental exposure in just content that we are always taking in over time, and the increase of that, is that overloading us in a way that empathy is now being absorbed in a different manner?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about empathy is that it's meant a lot of different things in different moments in time, right? So, for example, in the 1950s, it was really associated with advertising, for example. And I think more recently, it's interesting how it has been used even in political campaigns as a term. So because the term itself is so fluctuating, I think it's a difficult one to grasp. What we what we were doing here was to say there was something interesting and fertile in this first iteration of the term, right? In this possibility of feeling into other bodies and this possibility of othering ourselves. And we thought that would be important today because it could work as a tool, as a design tool, right? To think and help us think of collectivity, of community, of citizenship in broader ways than just human-centered. And it would provide us with, I think, a field for imagining different ways in which design could operate like that. The digital saturation and I think the atomization of society, well, it was already on the rise, and I think COVID definitely accelerated that process. But it's interesting that on the one hand, yes, we've become increasingly isolated and digital. I mean, there was a process of digitalization that happened through COVID, but also there was a physical permanence that also happened at the same time, right? And I have watched around me, obviously now, before COVID, we thought of ourselves as much more mobile, much more volatile presences, right? And nowadays, I think we are, again, very conscious of the distance that really exists between us in different countries or, you know, so there's also an attunement, I think, to the place we're in. And I think we've gained a new kind of attention. We're paying a different attention to the context that maybe surrounds us. And of course, I'm very conscious that we who are here on Zoom are in a very privileged position. But for those of us who have been able to cope with the situation, I think it has also led us to rethink what we mean by place and by local. And so, but there's an interesting paradox, I think, between living this extreme digital life, but at the same time being so being incredibly nomad digitally, but very rigidly fixed territorially in a way. I don't know what that will produce exactly, but for example, in our observations in Istanbul, it led to, for example, a lot more people growing their own food. It led to pieces of land that had been abandoned for a long time being cultivated for the first time. I don't know exactly how to, but I think it's a really pertinent question. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, again, thank you so much for the questions and for the conversation to the students and to Mariana. This was super inspiring. I think, you know, I really commend you for this incredible endeavor, this project on the role of empathy in the way that it can be thought of and leveraged today to ask questions. I love the way that in your presentation in the beginning you talk about like the necessity or the requirement for yourself to start from a position of doubt. That quite beautifully, I think, throughout the presentation, you never quite seem to be interested to resolve, to conclude, you know, to neatly packaged into this sort of enlightenment model that you were sort of starting off from or criticizing in the beginning. So I think that's really special, especially when I think you bring up the difficulty of, or the impossibility of embodiment, right? across multiple dimensions, across multiple scales, across different ecologies, but also I would argue across different human beings. I think often, unfortunately, I think the empathy is jeopardized by a movement of that tries to sort of diminish the differences and sort of flatten the inequalities and this impossibility to actually live in someone else's or acquire someone else's point of view, and it's used as a way of sort of I don't know. I'm thinking of like color blindness, which is an idea of avoiding the confrontation with the impossibility of seeing from someone else's position. So I think it's really amazing to see how in all of the projects, in your prompts, in the way in which you've set up the curatorial project of the biennial and other projects, that there is never really an ambition to get to this common ground where we finally we get to that sort of stable ground where I get everything of that other entity, whether it's a different human being or another scale, microscopic scale, etc. So I think that's really exciting. And maybe on a totally different conversation, I'd like to extend this impossibility of getting to the stable ground for our students. Think of this as a broad program that comes to Italy and investigate the historical, cultural, and material context of a borgo, for example, in this case, Castiglione d'Orcia in Tuscany. And I think within our discipline, there is often this ambition of perhaps empathize with the site, or to reach some sort of like root of a site where you can establish a single narrative for what that site looks like, or what it's supposed to act like, or what it's supposed to feel like, at all different scales. So if in your practice, it seems to be predicated around the idea of this ongoing project that never really ends and only opens this sort of cascading of collaborations. And this is an impossible question, so please forgive me for doing this, but like how does an architecture student thinking of like sort of projecting an intervention, a design intervention, a community intervention, can operate in such paradigm without sort of creating something fixed, their own, one could argue, privileged imagination of that community, rather than sort of this open, emergent, and transforming system?
Yeah. So yeah, thank you. That's a great question. What we do, for example, at the decorators, in terms of like very practical methodologies, we have this method of deep listening that we develop. So through radio, often, where we set up mobile radio, we go out to places and we interview many people on the go. So normally we make this radio public so that there is some value in the interviewing process. So we make it public and open, honest. Sometimes we also, my colleagues Carolina and Suzanne especially, they've developed this methodology of handing over the microphone, let's say, to other groups who then interview other people. So again, this cascading of listening, so that you can reach beyond even your immediate circle, because often we can only reach a number of people. So there's this effort. But I believe in the current paradigm, it's also about, I suppose, it's just my suggestion, but maybe thinking about other forms of listening. So for example, one project that I didn't show you today, because it's also in the making, but you can see it on the 24th of April, in this not quite finissage that we're organizing. There's a project by Orkan Telhan and Eli. So Orkan is an artist and Eli is a group of architects based in Spain. And what they've decided to do was to collect soil from all the gardens, all the bostans in Istanbul, not all of them, but a selection of them that are quite representative. And then they extracted, in collaboration with the university in Istanbul, they've extracted the DNA of those soil samples. Then they identified different microorganisms that were present in those soils. Then they did like an ancestry search, really, compared their database with other databases and began to identify certain cultures and microbes and bacteria that exist in the soil. And they all of a sudden they could name them and they could know a little bit about where they came from. And all of a sudden they had a huge bank, let's say, of information, which they are now transforming into a series of stories about this microbial culture. And then the project that they've decided to do has both an architectural scale and a gastronomic scale, let's say. The architectural scale is they're building a kiosk to communicate these stories of microbial life in the gardens. So when you think of a city or a borgo, normally when you think of citizenship, you think of other humans like you that live in the city, of course, but what they are arguing for is that these microbes that live in the soil are so important for the future of the city, and they should be taken into consideration. So there's this kiosk about sharing this information, but they're also giving out a fermentation kit. And so this is, they've designed a microbial fruit, which is essentially like a spatial design at the gastro scale, which allows for 3 microbes to live together. And the way that they will exist in the future is that they will exist in the gut of each participant. So you, as a visitor, you become a guardian of this microbial culture, and you allow it to thrive into the future. And you can also imagine if you put it into boza, which is a fermented drink, and then the next boza is always made from the previous boza, you could make this culture live for a long, long time. So what Orkan does is he introduced, and Ellie, sorry, they introduced this idea of rewilding and gentrification, but they introduce it to the gut, which is great. So it's also about maybe not thinking of architectural outcomes as big scale interventions. Maybe they can be tiny. I think, I don't know.
That's lovely. Really, I think I speak for everyone to really thank you for joining our community and for giving us lots of inspiration at all different scales for the continuation of the research. And I hope that we can, one way or another, share with you to continue the conversation.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for your questions as well.
Of course. So until we are able to see you in person again, thank you, and thank you all for joining us.